Welcome to Reformed Thinking, where we take complex, high-stakes political problems and analyze the institutional architecture that shapes our world.
And we approach these topics with a sober view of history and human nature, using the clear lens of Christian realism.
Our mission today is a very specific deep dive into the architecture of ceasefires. We've got a stack of historical precedents in front of us, Korea, Cyprus, and Bosnia, to really analyze this agonizing dilemma. It's a dilemma facing any nation that wants to stop catastrophic fighting, but without conceding its fundamental sovereignty or, future justice. For a lot of nations right now, the question isn't if they should stop fighting, but how.
And that how is everything.
So the central dilemma we're tackling is this. What specific structure, what kind of institutional design for a cessation of hostilities actually avoids what we'd call surrender?
And that definition of surrender is, well, it's crucial. We're defining it here as one of three things. Either it's legal recognition of seized territory.
Okay, so you're making the theft official.
Exactly. Or it's a forced renunciation of your own legitimate claims. Or it's stripping a nation of its ability to defend itself in the future. The search for a ceasefire that avoids that threefold trap, one that's defensible, durable, and, well, dignified, that demands a kind of wisdom that goes way beyond immediate military calculation.
And that's precisely why we're starting where we are.
Right.
You suggest that to analyze this political and military problem, we need the wisdom of St. Augustine's City of God. For our listeners who might not be steeped in political theology, how does that perspective immediately shift our expectations about what peace even is or what it can be?
It immediately sets the context, and it just lowers our false expectations. We have to acknowledge this categorical distinction between the heavenly city and the earthly city.
Right.
The heavenly city is where true peace, what Augustine called tranquillitas ordinis, the tranquility of order, where that actually reigns. It's a state of right relationship with God and with man. The ideal, yes. But the earthly city, which is the realm of international relations and human governance, the best it can ever achieve is a fragile, temporary peace. At its absolute best, it is the restraint of active slaughter.
That is a very stark and frankly a pretty pessimistic starting point for any kind of political negotiation.
It's the only honest one, I think, if you're informed by Scripture. The doctrine of total depravity tells us that the human heart, left to itself, is perpetually inclined towards sin. So this utopian dream of a war to end all wars or some final diplomatic solution that's going to cleanse the heart of the enemy, that's a humanist delusion. Nations rage. And until the return of Christ, the magistrate's sword is a necessary restraint against chaos and tyranny. That's what Paul teaches in Romans 13:4. The magistrate is a call to hold back sin.
So this quest for a functional ceasefire without surrender, it's not a pursuit of biblical shalom.
No, not at all. It's an exercise in common grace. It is God's providential restraint of sin, mediated through these imperfect political structures, just to prevent the total self-destruction that humanity is absolutely capable of. We are seeking the least evil, most survivable political outcome in a fallen world, securing a space for life and liberty to continue.
So with that framework, we're going to examine how three historical archetypes, Korea, Cyprus, and Bosnia, managed to either mitigate or, aggravate these recurring structural failure mechanisms.
Right.
And this should give us a crucial fit test for modern geopolitics, helping us figure out what institutional features might actually work today.
We are studying architecture, precisely, so we can avoid repeating history's gravest errors. If you understand why ceasefires usually fail, then you can start to design one that has a chance of surviving.
Okay, let's unpack that conceptual framework and look at those failure points. It's so important to understand that a ceasefire isn't some spiritual conversion moment for the people fighting.
Not at all.
It's an institutional design. It's a coercive bargain struck under conditions of intense fear, uncertainty, and contested legitimacy. They exist to pause the physical use of coercion while leaving all the underlying political questions completely unanswered.
And that creates this constant temptation, doesn't it? To treat the pause as just a tactical interval, a time to rearm, consolidate your gains, or reposition your forces.
Which feeds directly into the first fundamental flaw you mentioned, the commitment problem.
Well, a commitment problem, yes.
Tell us more about that. What does that look like in practice, beyond the textbook definition?
Well, the commitment problem comes up because one side can rationally anticipate future gains that would make honoring the agreement, well, not in their best interest later on.
So they're thinking a few moves ahead.
Always. Maybe they think they'll rearm faster, or they'll get a better alliance shift, or their economy will recover, or maybe they'll just wait for the guarantor coalition, the outside powers, to fracture. They accept the pause because it benefits them now, but they fully intend to break it when conditions favor them later.
And this gets especially acute when the stakes are existential, right? When it's about survival.
Absolutely. Ceasefires are incredibly fragile when the disputes involve what we call non-divisible goods. Things like territory, sovereignty, or regime survival.
Things you can't just split down the middle.
You can't split sovereignty 50-50. So the winner-take-all nature of the conflict remains, and freezing forces in place can dramatically intensify this commitment problem. It allows the opportunistic actor to consolidate their seizure, to fortify positions, and maybe try to normalize the new illegal status quo, all while hiding behind the veneer of peace.
And there's a critical distinction here, right? It's not just about what the aggressive party might do. There's a mutual fear.
Yes. There's a different trap built into the structure. If an agreement requires the defensive side to pull back or demobilize or halt its own defensive weapons programs without credible, verifiable constraints on the aggressor,
And they're exposed.
they're completely exposed. That defensive side fears it will be exploited before it can reconstitute its own deterrence. The piece of paper you sign doesn't solve the problem. The architecture has to fundamentally shift the aggressor's calculus. It has to make future predation irrational or just too costly. It has to address the underlying economic and military incentives for cheating.
That clarifies the structural issue. But even if intentions are momentarily stable, what happens when the line itself becomes ambiguous and hard to police? That leads us to the second challenge: verification and attribution.
A ceasefire isn't a binary event like flipping a switch. It is a continuous, messy process. Violations, accidents, provocations, they're guaranteed to happen. Hundreds of them, maybe, a week.
So it's about managing them, not preventing them entirely.
It's about management. Failure happens when these incidents can't be detected quickly, attributed credibly, and then managed robustly before they cascade into renewed large-scale war.
This is where we run into what the material calls lethal ambiguity.
Exactly. Lethal ambiguity is the poison that dissolves these agreements. If the physical lines of separation are unclear, if the definitions of prohibited weapons are vague.
Or if you don't have rules for the new stuff.
Right, the new tools of modern warfare. The deniable, inexpensive drones, the long-range fires, cyber operations, electronic warfare. If the rules are contested, compliance instantly turns into a propaganda contest. Both sides can plausibly deny responsibility for a fatal incident, and that leads to an uncontrollable retaliation spiral because the facts are either unavailable or they're just disputed.
And the modern environment, the one that will define any future ceasefire, only makes this challenge harder. I mean, it's not 1953 anymore.
And that is the operational constraint. Inexpensive, mass-produced first-person view drones, FPV drones, precision long-range fires, small deniable special ops teams. They generate constant gray zone friction far away from the front line.
So it's not just about what you can see with binoculars.
Not at all. This makes verification incredibly demanding. A handful of observers in SUVs cannot verify a 1,000-kilometer front that's dominated by invisible electromagnetic warfare and microdrones. The ambiguity allows spoilers to operate efficiently under the cover of confusion, using plausible deniability to just chip away at the agreement.
So what's the solution?
Durable arrangements. They have to reduce the amount of trust that's required by making the facts observable, objective, and making disputes arbitrable through technology and rapid reporting.
The third crucial failure mechanism relates directly to incentives.
The enforcement problem. If the costs of cheating are low, cheating becomes inevitable.
Correct. A ceasefire without predictable, predetermined costs for violation just invites testing. It invites strategic probing. Imagine a scenario where one side seizes a new forward position, or they sabotage a critical piece of civilian infrastructure 50 kilometers behind the line, or they probe defenses, and the international community's response is just rhetorical condemnation.
Or slow-moving, toothless resolution at the UN. Right. They will just keep probing until the ceasefire either collapses or becomes functionally meaningless.
So credibility isn't just a general feeling. It has to be structural and highly specific.
It's entirely structural. Enforcement has to be credible, meaning the capability exists. It has to be timely, meaning the response is hours or days, not months. And it has to be proportionate, so the response escalates appropriately.
So you need clarity.
Absolute clarity about who responds, the guarantor coalition, by what authority and with what capability. Ideally, It includes automaticity.
What do you mean by that?
So a response doesn't require a fresh, agonizing political debate among the external guarantors every single time a shell lands or a drone crosses the line.
Yeah.
That lack of automaticity is the enemy of stability.
And the absence of that strong enforcement creates the worst possible scenario for the civilians trapped in that zone.
It creates the worst of both worlds, yes. Weak enforcement allows violence to resume gradually, but the political narrative insists the ceasefire still exists.
So the violence becomes normalized.
It normalizes low-level violence and violations. Civilians are trapped in this state of pseudo-peace where restraints erode daily, but the diplomatic channels are closed because officially the ceasefire hasn't technically failed. Strong, clear enforcement, on the other hand, stabilizes the ceasefire even when hostility remains intense because it fundamentally alters the expected payoff of cheating.
Okay, finally, we face failure mechanism number 4, spoilers and domestic politics. These are the internal actors who have a vested interest in the conflict continuing, even if the government is seeking a pause.
Right. These actors can be anyone. They can be hardliners who fear peace will expose their own irrelevance. They can be war profiteers who rely on illicit economies fueled by the conflict. Or they can be autonomous militias whose source of influence is their independent capacity for violence. These spoilers try relentlessly to undermine compliance,
How do they do that?
often by working through fragmented chains of command that a weak central government just can't fully control.
And the political legitimacy of the agreement itself is the key vulnerability here.
Absolutely. If a ceasefire is widely perceived domestically as capitulation or dishonorable pause, if the state is seen as accepting defeat, then the political leaders, even the ones who signed the deal, may feel compelled to overreact to every minor incident just to prove their resolve and maintain internal support.
So spoilers thrive in that environment.
They thrive when the political basis for the agreement is weak or when it lacks popular legitimacy. They can use a single, localized violation to unravel the entire political consensus needed for the ceasefire to hold.
These 4 failure mechanisms, commitment, verification, enforcement, and spoilers, they force us toward a design spectrum. On one end, you have monitoring only, purely informational, purely weak.
Then you move to peacekeeping, which physically separates forces and manages small incidents. It lowers the risk of an accident. Stronger still are enforcement-backed arrangements that use force or the threat of force to compel compliance.
And the strongest.
The strongest are explicit security guarantees. These are formal treaties where major external powers commit to defending one of the signatories, which raises the expected cost of renewed offenses to an existential level for the aggressor.
Okay. So our job in this deep dive is to see which of our case studies best deployed these structures and which failures they ignored.
Let's do it.
Let's start where the modern framework really began, back in 1953, the Korean Armistice.
The Korean Armistice, signed on July 27, 1953, is really the canonical archetype of stopping a large-scale war without resolving the fundamental political question of unification. It is a containment model. It prioritized stability through a hardened line, not a reconciliation model that was aiming for some kind of political synthesis.
And that hardening was deliberately engineered. It was institutional design.
Yes. The secular architecture depended critically on 2 things, separation and legibility. The agreement established the military demarcation line, the MDL, and it required both sides to withdraw 2 kilometers from that line of contact. This created the infamous 4-kilometer-wide demilitarized zone, the DMZ.
Tell us what the DMZ really is. It's often romanticized, but it's a terrifying piece of architecture.
It is architecture born of total distrust. Its purpose was purely functional, to reduce direct, inadvertent contact between the opposing forces by maximizing the distance between them.
So you lower the odds of an accidental clash.
You lower the probability that a localized clash, a small unit accidentally crossing a field cascades into a general war. Crucially, the MDL and the DMZ made the ceasefire legible. It was mapped, it was physically marked with thousands of yellow signs, it was referenced in all communications, and it was layered with minefields, tank traps, and observation posts. It transformed a vague front line into an absolute militarized boundary.
And that physical separation was paired with a bureaucracy designed to absorb friction and manage low-level conflict.
Right. It institutionalized procedures rather than relying on any kind of goodwill. It created the Military Armistice Commission, the MAC, for operational liaison between the combatant commanders, and the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, or NNSC, to handle inspection duties.
How did that institutional framework actually handle the inevitable friction? Did the NNSC work?
Well, it initially provided some legibility. It turned potential artillery strikes into detailed paperwork, providing a standing framework for communication.
So it cooled things down.
It cooled things down. It provided a way to manage claims before they escalated. However, the NNSC very quickly became a case study in failed verification.
Okay, explain that. What went wrong with the NNSC?
Well, the NNSC included representatives from Sweden and Switzerland for the UN side and Poland and Czechoslovakia for the communist side. Its mandate was to conduct inspections behind the lines, particularly at ports of entry, to ensure neither side was bringing in new, heavy weaponry.
Which was crucial for mitigating the commitment problem.
It was. But here's where Cold War politics just poisoned the entire system. The communist-aligned members, Poland and Czechoslovakia, systematically refused to agree to any inspection or any report that was critical of the North. They acted as proxies, not as neutral observers.
So their veto power essentially neutered the entire verification mechanism.
Precisely. The system lost its ability to verify facts quickly or credibly attribute violations. By the late 1950s, the UN side suspended the NNSC's inspection teams in the South because there was no reciprocity, and the Communist bloc was consistently blocking any verification in the North.
So that's a huge lesson right there.
It's a vital lesson. A mechanism designed to reduce friction only works if the members are truly neutral or if the mechanism has some kind of independent enforcement power, which the NNSC completely lacked.
Yet Korea's armistice has held for 70 years. If the verification mechanism failed so badly, its long-term durability can't be explained by separation and paperwork alone.
Correct. The line held because of secular durability anchored in credible deterrence. That's what squarely addressed the commitment problem. Monitoring could detect some violations, but the deterrence regime was what fundamentally prevented those violations from escalating into a full-scale offensive that would trigger a renewed war. It was stability through strength.
And the core of that deterrence was external.
It was the explicit security guarantee. The Mutual Defense Treaty, signed just a few months after the armistice in October 1953, committed the United States to meeting common dangers and allowed for the permanent, large-scale stationing of U.S. forces in the South. And that structural element made the expected cost of restarting a large-scale conflict irrationally high for the North Korean regime. Korea succeeded as an armistice because it was backed by a credible coalition capable of immediate, automatic retaliation.
Now, let's look at this outcome through the spiritual lens you introduced at the beginning. You suggest the Korean outcome, despite all its imperfections, is a strong manifestation of common grace.
I do. The DMZ itself, that physical scar on the landscape, is theologically symbolic. It represents the necessary barrier between the Free South, which imperfectly represents the political liberty that allows the city of God to flourish, and the North, which is a totalitarian regime given over entirely to the idolatry of man.
So the physical line reflects a spiritual reality.
It's an acknowledgement of the aggressor's total depravity. They cannot be reformed by treaties or reasoned with. They can only be contained based on the magistrate's mandate to bear the sword.
And this frame helps explain the agonizing moral choices involved when you're faced with the option of an imperfect ceasefire.
It clarifies the moral hierarchy for the state. South Korea did not legally cede territory. They rightly rejected the validation of theft, which would violate the Eighth Commandment's requirement to restore stolen goods.
Right.
But by agreeing to stop the killing, they pragmatically accepted limits to stop the dying. They prioritized the sanctity of life, the image of God and their citizens, over the immediate rectification of every inch of border. That's wisdom. Prioritizing preservation of life and securing liberty for the majority over maximalist territorial claims that would have guaranteed mass destruction.
And the historical fruit of this decision, as you mentioned, is striking in its theological consequence.
It's the justification for the entire sacrifice. The utility of the armistice was preservation. By securing a defensible free border for the South, they created the necessary space for the gospel to flourish. The contrast with the North, a spiritual graveyard, it's terrifying. The South experienced a missiological explosion. They established a vast network of churches and became a leading sender of missionaries globally. This is stewardship, securing a free space for the church to operate and fulfill the Great Commission, as outlined in the Westminster Confession of Faith. The armistice bought time and safety for the Holy Spirit to work.
The warning of Korea, however, is the concept of partition drift.
It's the price of that stability. An arrangement framed legally as temporary, a cessation of hostilities, not a peace treaty hardened, through decades of political normalization into a generational reality. The contested demarcation line became the central, organizing political fact for both states and for the international community. Stability was purchased at the price of long-term division, risking the permanent loss of the Northern Territory without ever legally recognizing that loss.
That sets a powerful baseline for what a successful, albeit costly, containment model looks like.
Now we move to our second case study. Cyprus. This is the archetype of buffer zone peacekeeping, which operates on a fundamentally different and arguably weaker logic.
A different logic, yeah. Optimized for managing heat, not imposing costs.
Yes. Cyprus illustrates stability that's achieved primarily through physical separation and immediate localized de-escalation. It's about suppressing escalation rather than forcing a political resolution. The goal is managing the conflict indefinitely, not achieving justice or political closure. And the secular architecture here is centered on the UN peacekeeping force in Cyprus, UNFICYP, which was established way back in 1964 and then reinforced after the 1974 military upheaval that partitioned the island.
The centerpiece is the buffer zone, often called the Green Line, supervised by the peacekeepers. Tell us about the physical reality of that line.
It is a vast, strange, and highly variable strip of land. It runs over 180 kilometers. In some places, it's just a narrow alleyway in Nicosia. In others, it's several kilometers wide, encompassing abandoned villages, ghost towns like Varosha, and even an old international airport that has been frozen in time since 1974.
So by physically separating the opposing forces, UNFICYP's goal is to reduce accidents.
It dramatically reduces the informational environment and the likelihood of accidental escalation. It improves verification locally and makes small incidents immediately arbitrable through UN liaison officers.
So the mechanism works well on the level of operational friction.
It provides real, tangible humanitarian gains. It means fewer casualties, predictable security for the civilian areas right next to it, and it manages the noise of the conflict. Stray fire, small provocations, water rights disputes. It blunts small spoilers and keeps the conflict from roaring back into mass violence, even as political progress has been stalled for 50 years.
So it's a fuse box.
UNCYP acts like a fuse box, yeah.
Yep.
It trips the circuit before a short circuit can become a fire.
But you view this model, this reliance on external neutral observers, as carrying a spiritual hazard. You refer to it as the error of trusting in princes.
I do. I view this arrangement as deeply spiritually problematic. It relies fundamentally on the moral fiction of the blue helmet. Neutral observers whose authority is derived from temporary UN resolutions, not from genuine sovereign resolve or any real deterrent capability. It shifts the foundation of peace from the biblical mandate of peace through strength, the deterrent capacity of the sovereign, to peace through procedure. The moment those procedures are challenged with real force, the whole structure just quivers.
Why is relying on the United Nations system in particular spiritually dangerous in this context?
Because the UN is a geopolitical manifestation of the Tower of Babel from Genesis 11. It's an attempt by man to achieve unity and authority without God. It lacks the moral will to enforce justice because it's composed of nation-states with fundamentally competing idols and self-interests.
And in this case, one of the permanent members is directly involved.
Directly involved in the conflict. Relying on such a body for ultimate security is what is warned against in Psalm 146.3. Put not your trust in princes, nor in the Son of Man, in whom there is no help.
And what's the political consequence of this spiritual outsourcing for the state that's the victim of aggression?
It normalizes theft. Because the buffer zone makes the conflict tolerable, it makes the situation manageable and predictable, especially for outside actors in Brussels or Washington. The underlying injustice of the partition just calcifies.
The urgency is lost.
The cold peace means the urgency of restoration is lost. The system substitutes quiet for justice. The world adapts to the unacceptable status quo, allowing the aggressor to gain the political benefits of time and de facto control. It is a national violation of the Eighth Commandment because the state fails to press with sufficient political and diplomatic force for the restoration of stolen property and sovereignty.
So, the warning of Cyprus is the logic of freezing. The conflict becomes manageable, therefore tolerable, and justice is perpetually deferred.
And furthermore, a mission that's optimized purely for de-escalation, while noble in its immediate humanitarian aims, has a very limited ability to impose costs when it's tested strategically. If one party, sensing an opportunity, decides to seriously revise the Green Line, which has been attempted, the peacekeepers observe, they report, and maybe they issue a stern press release.
But they can't stop it.
They cannot compel compliance against a determined, well-armed military force. The credibility gap is just enormous.
That brings us to our third archetype, Bosnia. This is the model where the ceasefire held precisely because it was enforced and embedded within a broader, internationally mandated political settlement, the Dayton Accords of 1995.
This is the strongest example we have of stability achieved through credible coercion and compliance mechanisms.
The secular architecture here was entirely about enforcement and credibility. It addressed the commitment and enforcement problems head-on. And the critical pivot was UN Security Council Resolution 1031.
Resolution 1031 authorized the Multinational Implementation Force, IFOR, under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. And this distinction is paramount. Chapter 6 is classical peacekeeping. It requires consent. It's about observing. Chapter 7 authorizes military action. It creates the legal basis and the capability for robust action, including the use of force to compel compliance with the agreement.
How did that Chapter 7 mandate differ in practice from the NNC in Korea or UNFICYP in Cyprus?
It provided teeth, IFOR, and its successor, SFOR, directly addressed the commitment problem by making renewed war mean confronting a mandated, powerful international force, not just lightly armed observers.
Right.
The military forces were authorized to seize weapons, to dismantle unauthorized military installations, and to dictate terms of movement. This dramatically raised the expected cost of cheating. Enforcement became non-optional. Violations weren't just reported, they were met with a decisive, structural response because the force was designed to implement the military terms, not just witness their breach.
And Dayton provided comprehensive scaffolding. It wasn't just a military ceasefire.
No, it was a comprehensive civilian and military settlement.
Yeah.
It created a massive civilian architecture, including the High Representative, the OHR, as the final authority in theater for civilian implementation.
And the OHR had real power.
They were even given the so-called bond powers, allowing them to dismiss elected officials and impose laws if local politicians were obstructing the peace process. This structural scaffolding linked military compliance directly to post-war governance, preventing the political vacuum that so often sinks fragile ceasefires.
However, enforcing peace by this method carried a very high political and moral price, which you critique as the heresy of syncretism.
The moral and political design of Dayton is a theological hazard because it attempts to solve the problem of sin, the underlying genocidal intent that fueled the war through sheer bureaucratic complexity. It created a state that is functionally paralyzed by its own institutions, attempting to force political unity where genuine moral or ethnic unity does not exist.
Right.
This is the era of being unequally yoked, forcing political light and political darkness, victims and victimizers into the same governing body. It violates the principle in 2 Corinthians 6.14.
What was the political consequence of forcing this syncretism?
The model structurally rewarded aggression. By granting the aggressor, the Bosnian Serb entity, a semi-sovereign entity called Republika Srpska, within the state they tried to destroy, the accords tacitly validated the political utility of ethnic cleansing. The result is a system of false shalom, where peace is proclaimed when there is no actual reconciliation or justice. It assumed that forcing enemies to sit in the same parliament resolves the underlying enmity.
But because it ignored total depravity, the enmity didn't disappear. It just went internal, leading to the creation of what you call the hostage state.
Precisely. Institutionalizing divisions forces enemies to walk together, but it gives the aggressor, or their proxy, an indispensable stakeholder position. They gain veto power, allowing them to sabotage the state from within.
How does that play out?
Well, the institutional inability to conduct a nationwide census, or blocking constitutional court decisions, or preventing essential economic reform. These are forms of internal political warfare. Bosnia is a hostage situation disguised as a complex democracy requiring permanent, ongoing international scaffolding and the presence of the High Representative just to prevent its constitutional unraveling.
So the warning of Bosnia is clear. Enforcement capacity can halt mass violence quickly and effectively, but the price is long-term governance dysfunction and near-total external dependence. The peace is a managed artificial condition, not a fully internalized political order. Okay, we now move to Section 5, comparative synthesis. Let's put these 3 historical models onto our matrix and see what structural lessons we can extract for the future. We have to analyze stability, credibility, legitimacy, and the danger inherent in each model.
If we look at the first axis, stability, which means line clarity, physical separation, and reliable routine de-escalation.
Korea scores highest here. The armistice institutionalized geography. a defined, defensible demarcation, and a mandated 2-kilometer pullback, creating the DMZ, which drastically reduces accidental contact.
Right. And Cyprus is good too, because the wide buffer zone and the permanent peacekeeping presence manage friction day by day, preventing small incidents from escalating.
And Bosnia.
Bosnia's stability was different. It was initially stabilized by the capacity of that massive I-4 enforcement force, not just by separation, though geographic separation did follow the line of control.
Okay, turning to credibility, which includes verification, enforcement, and deterrence, the order shifts dramatically.
It does. Cyprus is the weakest. Classical peacekeeping is optimized to observe and de-escalate, not to coerce or punish. It fails the enforcement test entirely.
Korea is intermediate. Its credibility comes not from the armistice document itself, which failed on verification with the NNSC, but from the post-armistice treaty commitment and the presence of capable external allies, which raised the cost of renewed war. It addressed the commitment problem through allied deterrence.
And Bosnia is the strongest on strict credibility, because that multinational force was authorized under Chapter 7, making military compliance non-optional and giving the mission the legal and operational muscle to impose immediate proportionate costs on violators.
Now, for the axis of legitimacy, specifically the preservation of non-recognition of seized territory and sovereignty, this is where we see the real tension.
This is the hard part. Korea preserved the possibility of a later political settlement by explicitly not settling sovereignty, yet it risked partition drift as that de facto line hardened over generations.
And Cyprus risks normalizing a chronic stalemate.
It allows the world to accept unresolved injustice as just a permanent feature of the landscape. And Bosnia, ironically, achieved formal sovereignty affirmation, but it created legitimacy strain through massive institutional complexity and a mandated dependence on external authority, like the High Representative, who could overrule elected officials.
So the unified warning across all three of these models is starkly consistent.
It is. Monitoring is not deterrence. Separation is not resolution. And stability purchased cheaply, or through institutional distortion, can cost the future political trajectory of the nation itself. We see three core traps: Korea's partition drift, Cyprus's managed stalemate, and Bosnia's political distortion and external tutelage.
So now we apply this structural knowledge to the constraints of the current conflict, the Ukraine fit test. We have three non-negotiable constraints based on the source material. First, the political constraint.
Any deal has to be defensible as non-surrender in the eyes of the domestic population and its allies. That means no legal recognition of territorial seizure. The legal status of the temporary line cannot be framed as a border.
Crucially.
And crucially, there can be no forced renunciation of claims to the occupied territory, and the nation cannot be stripped of its self-defense capacity, unlike certain historical post-conflict arrangements. If it fails this test, the government loses legitimacy, and the peace will be instantly undermined by spoilers.
Then there is the major institutional constraint, which immediately rules out one of our historical archetypes.
Right. Enforcement cannot depend on the UN Security Council. Since the aggressor is a permanent member with veto power, a Bosnia-style UN-mandated coercion model requiring Chapter 7 authorization is structurally impossible.
That's off the table.
Completely. Any effective enforcement mechanism has to be modular, built outside the UN framework, and activated by a coalition of willing guarantors to achieve immediate credibility. This is a hard and fast rule.
And finally, the operational constraint. The battlefield today is radically different from 1953 Korea or 1974 Cyprus.
The sheer length of the front line, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, combined with the widespread, inexpensive use of drones, long-range fires, and pervasive electronic warfare, means that classic slow-moving observation is just insufficient to achieve verification and attribution.
So what's needed?
Verification has to provide rapid, credible, and specific attribution of gray zone violations. It has to identify who violated what, where, and with what intent, or the entire ceasefire will dissolve instantly into a propaganda contest, much like the NNSC failure in Korea.
This analysis means that no single historical model fits perfectly. We need a hybrid modular architecture that combines the deterrence of Korea, the separation of Cyprus, and the enforcement clarity of Bosnia, but built outside the UN framework. We need an Armistice-Plus.
The pure Cyprus approach is just too weak against an aggressor who repeatedly violates international law. The pure Korea approach risks long-term partition drift without a clear political mechanism for future resolution.
And the pure Bosnia approach.
It trades battlefield survival for long-term political distortion and external tutelage, which is itself a long-term form of surrender. The solution has to be modular and resilient.
Okay, let's lay out the proposed hybrid architecture, the Armistice-Plus. Pillar 1 is separation and clarity, drawing the necessary lessons from Korea and Cyprus.
This starts with defining a mapped, legible line of contact with a mandated, mutually verifiable pullback. You create a buffer space wide enough, maybe 5 to 10 kilometers, to significantly reduce direct friction and the risk of accidental escalation.
And it would include limits on weapons.
Yes, clear limits on heavy weapon concentrations, specific artillery systems, and drone launch sites near the line. And the explicit warning is built into the text. This line is not framed as a border, but as a temporary, managed boundary.
How is the risk of partition drift countered here, beyond just the legal text?
It's countered by tying the functionality of the line to the other three pillars. Drift happens when the line becomes politically permanent. If the line is constantly being monitored, challenged, and linked to automatic political consequences, its de facto permanence is continually undermined by the living operational reality of the agreement itself. It remains an instrument of temporary conflict management, not a political settlement.
Pillar 2 is verification and public attribution, addressing the modern technological challenge and the lethal ambiguity problem.
This requires a standing, independent international monitoring mechanism staffed by, say, NATO or a specific G7 coalition, not the UN. This mechanism has to fuse human observation with technological sensing. Satellite synthetic aperture radar, acoustic data, signals intelligence, and long-range radar.
And the mandate is speed.
The mandate has to be to produce fast, credible findings, published in near real time, not slow patrol reports. It must clearly define gray zone violations, like FPV drone attacks on civilian areas or long-range strikes on power grids, and publish regular objective bulletins so that violations can't be buried under competing narratives.
This sounds like an enormous undertaking, but it directly addresses the NNSC failure in Korea by making the verifiers beholden to a single set of powerful guarantors.
Yes, the technological investment is the only way to solve the verification problem in the age of drones. If the facts are observable, objective, and published by a credible independent body, it forces accountability. It removes the aggressor's ability to maintain plausible deniability for systematic violations.
Pillar 3 is the teeth of the proposal. Automatic consequences and deterrence, directly addressing the enforcement problem without reliance on the UN veto.
This is critical for solving the commitment problem. We have to pre-commit a response ladder that is specified, scaled, and tied to the verified violations reported by the Pillar 2 mechanism.
And specified in advance.
Eliminating the need for political agonizing when a breach occurs. It's activated by the coalition of guarantors. And the consequences have to be graduated.
Give us an example of how that response ladder would be structured for minor versus major breaches.
Okay, a minor localized breach, say, artillery moving into a prohibited zone, might trigger Phase 1. Immediate imposition of targeted sanctions or asset restrictions on the commanders responsible, plus immediate disclosure of intelligence to the victim nation.
And a major breach.
A major systematic breach, like a sustained campaign of long-range missile strikes on civilian infrastructure, would trigger Phase 2. Accelerated defensive assistance, expedited transfer of specific anti-air systems, or sanctioned snapback against entire economic sectors.
So direct intervention is the last resort.
Only for an existential, large-scale offensive with the highest steps of the ladder, direct military intervention by the guarantor coalition be reserved. Credibility comes not just from capability, but from the absolute clarity of the trigger mechanism.
And the final pillar is legal and political framing, non-surrender, preventing the Cyprus stalemate trap or the Korean drift.
The text of the agreement has to unambiguously state that the ceasefire line is not a recognized border. It must defer final status and territorial claims indefinitely. This provides the necessary political ammunition to fight that partition drift internally.
And it has to do more than that.
More than that.
Yeah.
It has to establish a conditional political track linked directly to compliance. Phased confidence-building steps, large-scale prisoner exchanges, safe corridors for civilian returns, are triggered only by verified progress on the military de-escalation front. This resists the tendency toward a managed, unjust stalemate while avoiding the constitutional paralysis of the Dayton model.
We have to acknowledge the common objections raised against any ceasefire proposal. The first is always the rearmament window objection.
That objection is entirely valid against any traditional ceasefire that relies on trust or weak enforcement. The aggressor views the pause as a chance to reorganize and restock.
But Armistice-Plus is different.
Armistice-Plus prevents this by requiring verification strong enough to expose preparations, not just active fighting. If the intelligence pillar detects massive, unpermitted mobilization, or the introduction of new prohibited weapon systems. The pre-committed consequences, sanctions, snapback, accelerated defensive assistance, are triggered before the next offensive can even launch. The ceasefire has to be a constraint on mobilization, not a permission slip.
A second powerful objection is the hardening line objection, the Korea danger. Critics insist that any de facto line slowly hardens into a de jure reality regardless of the legal text on paper.
And the danger of partition drift is real. But it is a political outcome driven by normalization, not a legal necessity written into the text. Non-recognition has to be sustained actively. It requires deterrence, a living diplomatic process with clear, enforceable milestones, and a national narrative that treats the armistice as strategic survival, not as a settlement. The legal text that explicitly defers final status provides the necessary political and diplomatic ammunition to continually fight that normalization drift in every international forum. We have to seize the rhetorical initiative to remind the world that the line is provisional.
And the final pragmatic objection, the enforcement escalates objection. Doesn't building an automaticity and a response ladder turn a ceasefire into an unstable tripwire that drags guarantor external powers directly into a war?
Deterrence has to be credible, but it doesn't need to be reckless or require immediate military escalation. This is why the response ladder has to be deliberately graduated. The first steps are diplomatic and economic. The next steps are focused on enabling the victim's self-defense capacity, security, assistance, acceleration.
So direct military response is the final step.
It is reserved only for the most systematic major breaches of the entire framework. This structure actually makes cheating costly and predictable for the aggressor, which reduces the risk of massive miscalculation compared to an environment where every probe requires an improvised, politically charged response from the guarantors. Clarity reduces risk.
This analysis of institutional design brings us to the most agonizing element of all, the moral and spiritual question underlying the entire search for a ceasefire, the tragic moral choice faced by the nation. What about those citizens left behind under occupation?
This takes us right back to the finiteness of man and the constraints that providence places upon the magistrate. The state lacks omnipotence. To pursue a maximalist military victory when the means military, financial, political are demonstrably insufficient to guarantee success, that's an act of presumption.
So the state has a duty to all its people.
It does. But when total maximalist liberation guarantees the annihilation of the very people the state is sworn to protect, wisdom dictates a different course.
You're describing a situation of moral triage.
Yes. The lesser evil is securing the safety and liberty of the majority of the population and ensuring the continuity of the legitimate government and the state structures. This requires the state to acknowledge its own limitations and accept a temporary, agonizing pause in the name of preservation. This is stewardship in the face of impossibility.
And how should the church view those faithful citizens left behind under the boot of the occupier, separated by that armistice line?
Through the typology of exile, we have to view the occupation as a season of trial, not permanent defeat. We recall Jeremiah 29:7, which instructs the exiles in Babylon to seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf.
Because God is not limited by lines on a map.
He is not. We believe the Holy Spirit sustains the faithful even under severe persecution, and the church continues to gather and bear witness under tyranny. By accepting a ceasefire, the Free State preserves itself as a diplomatic advocate, a city of refuge for those who flee, and a powerful voice continually reminding the world of the injustice across the line.
So a pause in fighting must be used strategically for something deeper than just rearmament. It has to become a time of national and spiritual rebuilding.
It absolutely must. The time of the sword must give way to the time of the trowel, as Nehemiah describes, those who built the wall holding a weapon in one hand and a tool in the other. A pause in fighting has to be seized for national repentance and reformation. The greatest threat to the longevity and the health of the nation is not the tank outside the border, but the idol in the heart of its citizens. The focus shifts from war to building a nation that fears God, rooting out internal sins, and ensuring that the liberty purchased by blood is used to preach the gospel and rebuild the nation on Christian principles. This internal reformation is the only defense that is truly impregnable, securing the nation against corruption and internal decay during the time bought by the armistice.
The lesson from our 3 case studies is clear. A ceasefire must be designed as architecture, solving institutional problems through structural safeguards, not merely wished into existence through exhaustion or goodwill. It has to solve for separation, attribution, and automatic consequences to avoid those three historical traps. Korea's partition drift, Cyprus's managed stalemate, and Bosnia's political distortion. The Armistice-Plus model attempts to capture the best enforcement mechanisms while maintaining the legal and political integrity of the nation's claims.
And in the end, we conclude where we began, grounding our political analysis in eternal truths. True peace, Shalom, will not descend from a summit or a resolution passed by man's institutions. It will only come with the New Jerusalem mentioned in Revelation 21:2. We are constantly reminded by Scripture that here we have no lasting city. We accept the ceasefire of vigilance as a temporary gift of common grace, a shelter for the church, and a necessary space for national rebuilding. But our hope lies not in the success of the political structure. Our ultimate hope lies only in the return of Christ, who alone can guarantee that nations learn war no more. We occupy the time and the space he grants us until he comes.
A sobering, necessary, and structurally detailed analysis. Thank you for this deep dive into the complex architecture of survival.